And your position's not going to be identical with mine. We're never going to be identical. But you're going to bring something to the table, and I'm going to bring something to the table. And it seems to me that if you have a strong identity, as I say, Josefina Vidal walking in the room tomorrow, she has a very strong identity, believe me. And so does Roberta. That's good. That's the relationship you want to have. Well, I want to multiply that, not just two people, two individuals who I happen to know well, but multiply it out to a number of domains. And if we can start working on areas where each one brings something to the table, then I don't think you really have the issues you're talking about. Yeah, there's the stronger and the weaker. But I have a feeling that a Cuban talking with an American, a Cuban businessman, talking, or businesswoman, talking with an American businessman or businesswoman, the Cuban's going to come in thinking, oh my God, he or she has so much money and going to be able to swamp me. But the Cuban, I mean, that's what's great about, you know, those Cubans who never say thank you. That's the negative aspect. But the positive aspect is they feel great about themselves. And I think that's a little bit different in France, for example, where Frenchmen say, désolé de dire ça, avec un français de la salle, but I often have this talk with my wife. They don't feel good about themselves. And that's the problem. The problem is when you don't feel good about yourself. Now, the person who said to me last night, no, Cubans have a very negative self-perception. Well, then that's an issue for me. But so long as Cubans feel good about themselves, that's where I want them to be. Because then we can have a more normal relationship. Because I certainly feel good about myself walking in the room. But trust me, so long as I had conversations with Josefina Vidal, and after a while she decided to cut them off, but so long as we had conversations, she felt very good about herself when I'd walk in the room. So there wasn't a problem of self-definition and self-perception.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, in passing early on, the difference between the eastern and western parts of the island. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I think, well, anytime you talk about these things, I think it's, first of all, economic. Second, it's historic. But third, I don't know to what extent, I think someone needs to do a good study on this. And I look to Frank and Jorge. I think race has a lot to do with it. You can't go to an Industriales Santiago baseball game in el Estadio Latinoamericano without hearing the racist chants from the Industriales side of the stadium. Blatantly racist. Right? Racism such as we Americans who, you know, it isn't politically correct to talk like that. Well, Cubans haven't understood the concept of political correctness. And anytime you've got that element which enters into the equation. Now, since we've got nothing to talk about, go up to Baltimore or go to Ferguson, we can't walk in the room as, listen, I got the answer to this question. So maybe that's a good issue to start talking about. But I think race will always be an issue. Because, I mean, again, go back to Cecilio Valdés. You read Cecilio Valdés. You know, anyone who reads Cecilio Valdés can see the roots in the 19th century. And it was Cirilo Villaverde, a Cuban, in the 19th century, talking about this issue. I mean, it's subtle, but it's all the more fascinating for that reason. Yeah, so, but, I mean, yeah, because infrastructure is so much of an issue. Because the economy is so much of an issue. Because, you know, so long as the Communist Party is still in control of Cuba, the fact that there are so few from the eastern side of the island on the political committee, on the top rungs of Cuban leadership. I mean, I thought it was great that Raúl brought Díaz-Canel. And Raúl, you can say he's from the eastern side of the island, but yeah, fine, he's from Piran, but sorry, that's not the, you've been in Havana for way too long.
Yeah,
No, there's a student, I think, in the back of the room. Let me go to him first.
Oh, my question is in terms of communism, and how does that play in Cuban's identity? Is it the same way that plays, for example, for the Chinese, that the Chinese say, oh, communism with Chinese characters? Is that the same with Cubans in the sense that communism itself is not Cuban identity, it's part of the Cuban identity, it's something that has been imported?
I'm going to leave it to the Cubans to figure that one out. Russia is the first communist country. And maybe you could say Russia truly was a communist state. But every communist state that went communist after that had a very different definition. All right, then Eastern Europe came along, and they were pretty much on the Soviet model because there were so many troops occupying their country. But, and then Cuba came along, and it was a different definition of. So Cuban communism is so different than Vietnamese communism, than Chinese communism, and it seems to me the Cuban leadership has made clear that, no, we're not necessarily going to go the Chinese route or even the Vietnamese route. You would think that Cuba and Vietnam, it's a much closer comparison. I can see why you wouldn't want to, try and put yourself in the same league as a country of 1.3 billion people. Okay, fine, so you leave the Chinese aside, but talk about Vietnam. No, we're going to go by our own model. Well, to me, that's kind of an assertion of Cubans feeling good about themselves. Now, I'm sorry that it was to put up a communist regime or a dictatorial regime. In any event, until 2009, I don't think you could really call it Cuban communism. I think you call it fidelismo. But I'll leave people who do far deeper research on these subjects to make a bold assertion like that. But that's my sense. It was all fidelismo. In fact, I think the arrival of Raúl to power finally gives Cuba a chance to convert itself back to genuine communism. Although, the state of the Cuban economy is so disastrous, it's kind of hard to build a communist state on the basis of rubble. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
My question in connection with your comments about self-confidence and Josefina Vidal, do you think that the Cuban leadership before communism, before the revolution, the diplomats that dealt with the United States, like Oreste Ferrara and Núñez Portuondo, did they lack self-confidence in your view?
No, because they were Cuban.
So, and that led to the relationship that Cuba had with the United States.
Yeah, but if you read the diplomatic record, the Cuban foreign ministry was running circles around the State Department. Cuban foreign policy was extremely subtle and extremely clever. Now, they weren't working for real competent governments. I mean, I don't think you'd call the Machado government a real competent government. I certainly wouldn't call the Batista government a very competent government. It's not just because I'm a Guiteras. And I had a relative who was assassinated by the Batista forces. I don't think that Cuban foreign policy was terribly bad. Cuba played a very strong role in a lot of international fora. In the creation of the United Nations in the 1940s, the diplomatic record shows a very positive role that Cuba was playing, and the Cuban ambassador in New York and the Cuban ambassador in Washington. So I don't think Cuba has anything to worry about there. And what I'm saying is there was a continuity in that. And I guess one of the questions I had in my mind in 2005 when I went down to Havana was to what extent Cuban nationalism, and it's the question I've been discussing with Jorge, with Dr. Duane, virtually as long as I've known him, to what extent did Cuban nationalism survive the revolution? Or was it strengthened by the revolution? How was it affected by the revolution? By what happened in January 1st, 1959, and everything that happened since then. Because I'm convinced, and I was convinced by 3 years in Havana, that Cuban nationalism was still alive to say it, but what was her name? The name escapes me. But one of the leading is Marta Beatriz. She's about as Cuban nationalist as you can get. And she was very sympathetic. And when she realized that I was a Guiteras and a descendant of Guiteras, she went out and she found the only Guiteras relative still living on the island. And brought the phone book to me and said, there's the address. Because she understood the power of Cuban nationalism. Now, of course, the Cuban government currently in power would never recognize that Marta Beatriz was a true Cuban nationalist. But then, you know, Jaime Ortega is a Cuban nationalist. And when I used to see him, I tried to go see him about once every 3 months, not just because I'm a Catholic, and it was kind of a way of, then I would say to the Lord, I had my confession for the next 3 months. Jaime and I would often talk about these subjects. And those conversations led me to the conclusion that, Cuban nationalism really is alive. Still in Cuba.
What will we be able to do as an embassy that we cannot do as an interest section? I'm curious.
I'm proud of the fact that the 3 years I was chief of mission in Havana, we functioned pretty much as an embassy. There are things that Roberta will be discussing tomorrow with Josefina that hopefully Roberta will be able to achieve and acquire from Josefina, and that Josefina will be discussing with Roberta and will be able to achieve from Roberta. Structural things, but you know, when I was down there, I never was, you can't call me Mr. Ambassador because I've never been confirmed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Hopefully Jeff will be, but Jeff already is an ambassador. So you have to call him Mr. Ambassador. And it wasn't that clever on the part of the White House to send down someone who already had the title of ambassador as our diplomatic representative. That wasn't an accident. And good for the White House for doing that. I think that's what Roberta is negotiating with Josefina these days. She wants to get concrete assurances that that the embassy will be able to function as an embassy. But an embassy is very much the result of who's the ambassador. I mean, I was serving under Felix Rohatyn in France. Felix took things in a totally different direction. Washington only had one condition for Felix. Fine, Felix, you can do whatever you want. Just realize we're not going to increase your budget. So, if Jeff becomes the ambassador or the head of the diplomatic mission when we reestablish diplomatic relations,